Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. So we're doing a second segment here with Wyatt Claypool. We just did a segment on the biggest winners and losers of the election. So if you haven't already, go watch that one first. You can watch this one second before we get back into it. Just going to ask you quickly to like the video. It really helps us with the YouTube algorithm, really helps us get discovered by more Canadians. Okay, so in our biggest winners and losers list, we didn't explicitly put Pierre Poilievre on either list. And I think it's just because it's a gray area. There's a lot of good things that happened on Monday night and a lot of not so good things that happened. So we wanted to do a separate segment here to talk about our advice. We're giving some free advice to the Conservative Party, the War Room, and to Pierre Poilievre and his campaign on what we think they should have done differently. Now, I want to start by just putting one sort of rumor to rest. I don't think this is true, and it is spreading a lot. I hear this a lot from people. I heard it from Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, and many others, that Pierre Poilievre blew a 20-point lead. And while in a certain sense that might be true, I just want to walk you through the numbers and the facts here. Because look at this. This is from the polling aggregate 338, and it shows the polling numbers dating back to January of 2024. Now, Wyatt and I talked in the last segment about why we don't always trust the pollsters and we think that they got it wrong during the election. But I think generally speaking, you can use it as a good barometer to find out where someone is polling. So if you go back to January 2024 and go all the way through to today, you will see that, yes, Pierre Poilievre did have a 20-point lead, but that is because the Liberal numbers were so down. Pierre Poilievre has the entire time been polling around 40%. I would say that that is the average going back. It was right at 40% in January 2024. It bumped up to 42, 43% in the time when Justin Trudeau was just wildly unpopular. And then he kind of stuck around in that 41 to 43% area. He got a little bit of a bump at the end of the year, 2024, and beginning of 2025, when Justin Trudeau was just at peak weakness. And then you can see the major thing that happened is that the NDP vote collapsed. So the NDP vote collapsed. They basically did what Ezra Levant called a controlled demolition of the party, and all of their voters did exactly what they were told and went over and voted for Mark Carney. So Mark Carney's victory came at the expense of the NDP. Mark Carney did a miraculous 20-point turnaround. That's what he accomplished. But in order to say that Pierre Poilievre blew a 20-point lead, you would have to assume that he fell 20 points. He didn't. He maintained his share. We talked about this before. He got a greater percentage of the vote than any Conservative has since the 80s, folks. And he got a higher percent even than Stephen Harper in any of his governments and in his 2011 majority government. Wyatt, what do you think?
And like we mentioned in the last segment, the Conservatives also gained seats that they hadn't won in literally several decades. So this isn't something where we've taken our geographical appeal and we've moved the borders a little bit over. In fact, it was a very strange election where not only were the seats, like, not only did the Conservatives gain a lot of seats, but the Liberals just happened to gain even more seats. The thing with the Conservatives is that they ended up actually shifting their appeal in a more blue collar direction. We had more minority supporters, a lot of union workers voting Conservative. Obviously, Western rural voters were still very solid Conservative voters, but it's more so on the other side of things. Things shifted in such a way for the Liberal Party that they ended up capturing a lot of seats that maybe we assumed were safe. Not only was it Carlton, Pierre Poilievre's seat, although again that was helped by a redistribution of boundaries into a more liberal area, and that was always a riding I'd heard that Poilievre in the past had to fight for to maintain his 10% victory margin. But we also lost Michelle Ferreri in Peterborough, who was a fantastic MP. We lost Carolyn Finley in South Surrey White Rock, and these are just areas where we had just to, in demographics, the demographics that went against Conservatives were older white voters, basically legacy media viewers. And obviously, if you're watching a show like mine on YouTube or Candace's, you probably voted Conservative no matter what age bracket or other demographic you're a part of. But it did make a difference. Those were kind of the battle lines of this election. It was those metropolitan suburban ridings that went more liberal, which went very liberal if they were especially more older white ridings.
That is all very true. But I don't want to sugarcoat it. Okay, I did an entire show on Tuesday of all the good news from the election. I complimented Pierre Poilievre. I think he ran a very good campaign. It's hard to criticize the Conservatives when they walk away with 41.3% of the vote. That is enough to win in a majority government in almost any other circumstance. But because of the weird thing that happened in this election, it wasn't enough. I do want to focus on my criticisms of the party in this episode, and I want to kind of zero in on two different areas. There were one, the strategy and tactics, and two, the policy. So let's start with strategy and tactics because you mentioned losing Carlton. Wyatt, I think this is unforgivable. I think from a strategy perspective, I don't want to put the blame squarely on Pierre Poilievre or whether it should be his campaign manager or his war room or whatever it is, but it is so unforgivable for a party leader to basically be allowed to be humiliated in the way that he did. Now, you mentioned that it was partially because of the redrawing of the district. Well, that is something that we have known about for a very long time. It should have been prepared, right? So if, Pierre Poilievre's riding used to be very rural and it used to be a bit more reliable, if they all of a sudden they added suburbs that we know are where government employees live, and we know that federal employees are basically the base and the constituency of the little party, that should have all been predictable in the in advance of the campaign. And so I don't understand why they didn't put more resources, more volunteers, more money, have Pierre Poilievre spend more time in his riding if it was that much of a concern. I mean, I'll say frankly, the Friday before the campaign, I had you on my show and we called it Fake News Friday and we laughed at it, right? And I will admit that we got it wrong. I'll admit to the audience that sometimes we get it wrong here at the Candice Malcolm Show. I thought that the legacy media was lying about that they were pushing this story to try to humiliate Poilievre. I didn't realize that it was actually true, that he was actually at risk of losing his seat, and he did, and it wasn't necessarily that close. And so if they knew this in advance, which they should have, if they didn't know this in advance, they should all be fired because this is unforgivable. Put Pierre Poilievre in a safer riding. He's the leader of the party. He's the head of a movement. He's done so much for the Conservative Party. Find a safer riding. Come up with an excuse. Say him and his family wanted to move out of the Ottawa area and they moved to this part of rural Ontario. Put them in a safe seat. And so the fact that they didn't is unforgivable. That is a huge L in my perspective. What do you think?
Well, and here's the thing I frequently say about people who work in politics in terms of campaign staff and consultants and managers is that their big problem is that instead of being strategists and managers, they become risk managers. That is all they care about. They end up really pulling punches. They don't want to risk anything because what happens if it turns bad on us? What happens if we actually get hurt by doing this? And you would think that these people who tend to be risk averse would have made the tactical withdrawal from Carlton, saying, hey, Poilievre loved being the MP from Carlton, but it is a riding where you have to really work for it if you're the Liberal or the Conservative, and you can't really do that if you're the leader of a party. You can't be constantly jet-setting back to your riding in order just to hit another few hundred doors to make sure people know that you still exist. You got to be out in the swing areas. So they should have been able to pull him back and says he's going to move over to a safer area of Ontario. He's going to move to Calgary, going to move to Edmonton. And the fact that, again, we assumed that he was going to win his riding partially on the assumption that his team wouldn't let him run there if he couldn't win.
Exactly. I think it's unforgivable. Okay, next in the strategy and tactics column, this is something that Pierre Poilievre got accused of a lot, and I half agree with this one. The idea was that they hid from legacy media, they refused to do sit-down interviews, and oddly, they didn't do enough with independent media, with content creators. I will say by the end of the campaign, Pierre Poilievre was out on podcasts. He did Jasmine Lane's podcast. I saw him on Northern Perspective. He was there, but he didn't do very much of that. He didn't, like we said in the last episode, he didn't do a lot of the big US podcasts. I don't think that really hurt him per se, but it did there was a sort of image that he was kind of hiding, that he wasn't out there in the media in the way that he has shown been able to shine in the past. And on top of that, I heard this from so many people in local campaigns that they wouldn't let local candidates do anything. Like local candidates were not allowed to so much as do a local radio interview. They were told not to go to their all candidates forum. They were basically told to just go knock on the doors. And that was a strategy. And I know that was a strategy in the past with the Harper government, like really tight message control. Don't let anyone say anything. We don't want the national story to become about some local candidate that slightly went off script. Like I understand all that. But I think in 2025 with the media landscape, with everyone with social media, you have all these people who are assets, all of your candidates. Why not let them go out there and field some questions and take on the issues, right? Like you're only going to win the battle of ideas if you show up for the fight. And so it was a little disappointing to see this strategy of sort of ducking and hiding. What do you think?
Yeah, a few things on that. So first off, let's also just acknowledge the fact that while Harper's people did do this, Harper also lost in 2015. Harper did this to perfection in 2015, just run a campaign that makes people feel nice and easy. And you don't make any mistakes, and hopefully then they'll return you to office. And the thing that he was hit for often, and it might be unfair, but it's just how people vote. They thought, well, Harper's stale, Harper's boring. Let's have the guy with nice hair be the prime minister. And we could say that a lot of voters fell for it, but that's just how politics ends up working. Another thing too here is that anyone who knows anything about marketing knows that you need a lot of different touch points with people in order to convince them that you're the guy or that they should buy this product. And if they're only ever seeing you while knocking their door, well, you're going to maybe talk to a third of voters, because if you've ever gone door knocking, most people are not home all the time. And putting a leaflet in their door and them seeing a YouTube ad from HQ is not going to make a lot of people feel like I definitely got to run out of the house at 7 a.m. to put a ballot in the ballot box for these people. And so they needed, those little touch points. A local podcast, local radio show. They should be showing up to events. I heard that candidates were having to ask permission to go to events. So apparently you have to ask to go to a farmer's market, and in order, like, even though you need to connect with people in your local area. I heard candidates who at some point they just said they had a party handler with them, and eventually they kind of worked a relationship with the handler where you pretend like you're trying to stop me from doing these things so you don't get fired, and I'm gonna go speak to the community leaders and do the shows and do the videos that I want to do because we got to win this thing. And they were probably right for doing that. And then the last thing on this is that the Conservative Party, its strength over time has always been that it's a party of big characters, big personalities, people who are really big community figures. You could say that some of them are eccentric. At the same time, they won back in the day. I always think of my former MP, Rob Anders, who always used to be able to win easily in Calgary West and Calgary Signal Hill. He would win by rural numbers in the city of Calgary, 75% in some of his elections. Yes, it's a safe riding, but you only make a riding that safe when there's a good portion of people who actually do like you. And when you end up stripping away all the virtues of a candidate and you're just left with them as a political machine going around asking people for votes, you're going to find there's a certain type of voter who thinks that, well, this feels a little bit like I'm just being rushed out to put a ballot in the ballot box. This isn't like the 1880s that, we don't just stick ballots in people's hands and force them into the booth.
Well, it's interesting because we talked in the last segment about the People's Party, Maxime Bernier, and so their criticisms of the Conservatives. And in this way, I do kind of prefer the American system where there is no central party that controls all the candidates across the country. So what you end up happening in the States, you have the individual representatives and candidates for the Republican Party actually being more connected to the base. They have an incentive to be more conservative and more right wing because they want to get elected. Whereas in Canada, it's almost the opposite, where we end up with this time around, certainly we have a more conservative leader. And then in many ways, they've planted like red Tories throughout the campaign just to keep them quiet, to keep them in line. They don't want to have the kind of big personalities like the Rob Anders that you talked about. And it is disappointing. I would have liked to say, it's 2025. You have to meet viewers where they are. Do more things on TikTok. Get out there more. Have more people articulating the vision of the future under a conservative government. I think that this happened in the U.S. election, Wyatt, it wasn't just Donald Trump, right? Like I talked to many people, Americans, that were convinced to vote for Trump when they saw J.D. Vance on the VP debate stage because he just seemed so stable and competent, and he was able to articulate Trump's vision in some ways better than Trump himself. You also had people who voted for Trump because of someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard, or people who were part of the coalition, and they were all empowered to go out there and speak on behalf of the movement. And here in Canada, it just seemed like it was all on Pierre Poilievre's shoulders. And then again, his strategy was in many ways to not, he was doing his rallies, yes, but at his rallies, he was sort of giving the same speech over and over again. So you weren't really seeing anything new or dynamic on the campaign.
And that's the thing, is that Poilievre at his best is Poilievre just doing what he wants. Poilievre at his best is Poilievre on the debate stage, where you can go in with a script, but you can't exactly script out a debate. You got to kind of move on the spot. That's why Mark Carney, frankly, wasn't very good on stage, because if it's not a scripted answer, he's going to fumble it. But he's always good on the debate stage. He's good on Jordan Peterson's podcast. He's good when he's connecting with people who may be low propensity voters, convincing them that maybe you should turn out. Because I think that we truly probably were a few Canadian podcasts, because I don't think the Americans would have really helped that much. Plus, it would have fueled the idea of, oh my goodness, look, Pierre Poilievre's going down south to speak to the media. It's
Right, doing
because
what
he's
Trump did.
secretly
Yeah.
an American.
Yeah.
But we were probably a few podcasts away, a few candidate debates away, in terms of the local candidate debates. We were probably a few community events away from a lot of these ridings flipping blue. But the thing is that something I often say about the conservative strategy is that they fight it like blockhouse warfare. We have our territory, we have our 42% of the vote that we think we can get. Now we're just going to put blocks houses along the territory to defend it. But the problem is when you play a purely defensive game, the best you do in a day is you don't lose ground. And the worst you do is you lose everything you have because you always have to be offensive at all times. You always have to be taking territory at the same time that you're defending. And the Conservative Party, of course, did that at times. But I think with their local candidates, they didn't let them loose to go on the offensive.
Well, what you're describing is exactly what happened in 2021 when Aaron O'Toole just assumed that the base would show up for him. And so he tried to tack to the left, to the center, copying the Liberals on everything from their carbon tax to all their social policies. And it just didn't work for him. It fell apart. And the base was so betrayed that they ousted him as leader at the first possible opportunity. Well, I want to tie this next one into what you're saying. This is kind of a mixture of tactics and strategy and also policy, which is that as soon as Donald Trump came in with the 51st state stuff and Mark Carney became the leader, it seemed like Pierre Poilievre was just sort of caught flat-footed, where he had been so effective at playing offense, at hitting hard against Justin Trudeau, hitting hard against the fake news and legacy media. And then all of a sudden, he turned around and he had to play defense to the accusations that he was too much like Trump, too pro-American, and that he wasn't differentiating himself. It seemed like at that point, the strategy was just to copy the Liberals and to adopt their policy on Donald Trump so that they couldn't be accused of that. It seemed insincere, and it made Pierre Poilievre, again, seem like he was playing defense. It seemed like he got stuck in Aaron O'Toole mode. And when I interviewed him in mid-February, when I sat down with Pierre Poilievre for my exclusive interview at that time, I asked him, why is a conservative advocating for a 25% liberal tax on Canadians, right? That is what the policy was for the Conservatives. They agreed there should be dollar for dollar reciprocal trade against tariffs against the Americans. So if the Americans are going to slap 25% tariffs on goods coming to Canada, we're going to slap them on goods coming from the US. That's a tax on Canadians. Andrew Lawton even said this on my show yesterday, that tariffs are bad and they hurt everyone. And I'm thinking the Conservatives advocated for tariffs in this election. That was their official policy. I think that that was a mistake. What do you think?
And there was an easy win in it because by adopting the liberal policy, all you're doing is just reducing the positive effect of them saying it first by saying, well, both of these parties do advocate for it, but the first party to say it always is going to get the most credit. And obviously, the government has the advantage because they can actually implement. But what the Conservatives should have been doing on that is what they were doing on the issue of crime, with Poilievre saying that multiple murderers cannot serve all of their sentences at the same time. They have to serve them consecutively. He ended up baiting out Mark Carney into then saying, well, I think that could be seen as an abuse of power. That's not what the notwithstanding clause is used for. It's like, are you defending multiple murderers? And what they should have done on trade is saying, no, what? Like, we shouldn't be putting out reciprocal tariffs. We should be cutting taxes. I was constantly saying on my show that what they should be painting the picture of is that it seems like Mark Carney is only upset by Trump putting on tariffs because it's usually him and the Liberals' job to kick Canadians in the face. That the whole point is maybe we should outcompete the Americans, not just sort of go down to their level. And do you know who actually had probably the best response on the 51st state rhetoric by Trump? It hurts me to say it. It was Green Party leader Elizabeth May, because she joked about it and then she moved on. She talked about, well, I don't think Canada should be the 51st state. I think California should be the 11th province. It's like, that's a good line. That's just a good line. And that's something that someone in HQ should have thought of. But the problem what they do is they start focus grouping everything, and that's why it felt like everything screeched to a halt probably
Well,
for a couple months. They were focus grouping it.
yeah, and then they were on their defense or flat-footed, and it just lost some momentum at a critical time. Pierre Poilievre's strength, right, was explaining complicated things that were happening in the economy with taxes, with inflation, with housing prices, and explaining it to Canadians in a way that made sense to them and coming up with a different solution. I could have just as easily seen them say, listen, a tariff is bad, whether it is a Trump tariff or whether it is a Carney tariff. It is a tax on you. And all this is a 25% tax on Canadians in the middle of this economy, in the middle of all of these other taxes they put on us. They now want to slap another 25% tax on Canadians. I think that should have been Poilievre's line. I think he would have been really good at it. And I think it could have led to a different outcome in the election. Now, I don't want to come down too hard on them because, like I said, they got 42%, 41% of the vote. They did win a lot. And, maybe their strategy was just fine. But this was one thing that I think that they could have done differently. And I think that it could have had a difference. I want to talk a little bit about other policy positions because I think that overall, Poilievre was really good on policy. If I had to do a report card, I would have given him like an 8 out of 10. But I think that they could have maybe benefited from going a little deeper and making a more clear differentiation. So back in 2011, when Stephen Harper won, he kind of famously had like very simple, I think it was like a 5-point plan. It was like lower the GST. It was very simple and very easy to understand. I wish that Poilievre had come up with something like that. I think he could have utilized the immigration issue. I think he could have come out and said, we're going to cap immigration at a lower number. Any lower number, 150,000, 200,000, maybe go even low as 100,000. And that would have been something that could have stuck with Canadians. Instead, he never really clearly came out and said his immigration number. I know when he did that interview with me back in February, he said he was going to go back to Harper level numbers, but he never put an exact number on it. So I would have liked to see Pierre have a few more very specific policies. What do you think?
I actually did a poll with Kolsovsky Strategies showing that a 100,000 PR immigration cap for several years would get 75% of Canadians on board. A 75% reduction would get 75% of Canadians on board, including 58% of people voting NDP and 72% of people voting Liberal. And that's what your policy book should do. It shouldn't just be ideas where people look at it and say, well, that sounds nice. It should be things that actually get people to think hard. Something that's not been proposed before, but it becomes a wedge issue. Are you on side with over 400,000 new immigrants, new permanent residents per year? Or do you want it to be 100,000 so that your kid can actually buy a house in the next few years? And I think that's what they need to do. And on certain topics, they did do it. Again, on crime, they did it pretty well. On other issues, they had done a good contrast with the Liberals. But on things like taxes, I know his tax reduction for under $50,000 was much bigger than the Carney Liberals. Carney had wanted to cut it by 1%. Poilievre had wanted to cut it by 2.25%. I would have said cut it by 2.25% for every bracket, because that's how you're going to get the upper middle class people who are watching legacy media all day, who think that they need to vote to stop Trump, to actually say, wait, Carney's supposedly trying to protect me, but he won't even cut my taxes. And that's what I would have gone after him on. I actually liked when he says, I'm going to get rid of the industrial carbon tax. Guess what? That didn't hurt the Conservatives at all to say that they were going to get rid of the industrial carbon tax. But, and I didn't think they played it well enough, but they could have put Carney in the patriotism trap of saying, okay, so you want to defend Canada, and you don't want Canada to become the 51st state, but you're going to keep punishing our businesses far more than the Americans do with their taxes. So, sorry, who here is the person who's the person hurting Canadians more? The man who doesn't want to actually lower corporate taxes, or the person who's just put in tariff on all imports on certain products? Like, you almost seem worse than Donald Trump on this particular issue, and I think we should just not have either tariffs or carbon taxes.
Okay, hear me out on this. This is what I think that Pierre Poilievre should have run on. 100,000 immigration cap. 2, no tariffs. 3, no more consecutive life sentences. Throw the murderers in jail. 4, I love it. Across the board, tax cuts for every bracket. And 5, this is very simple, and this is something the Conservatives were afraid of in the campaign. Boys are boys, girls are girls, and they cannot change. And I think that last one is something that has been a winning issue in the United States, been a winning issue in the United Kingdom. It is a big cultural issue at the time. It is very important in the minds of parents, in the minds of anyone who has a daughter who plays sports, anyone who is concerned about women's prisons or women's shelters. This is a major issue. And I saw that the Conservatives were just too polite, too nervous, too worried, didn't want to touch it. And that's too bad. I'm not trying to stoke divisions and play up identity politics. That's not what I'm trying to do. But it is a principled issue, and it is an issue where the Conservatives can be wildly successful if they're willing to articulate the issue in a good way. So I think those 5, if that was his policy, I think that Pierre Poilievre would be prime minister right now.
You're absolutely right, because when I ran for a Conservative Party nomination in Calgary Signal Hill, my 3 points I'd always hit people with was a parental bill of rights. I wanted a 2/3 reduction in immigration at the time. This is 23, 24, so I would have probably increased it now if I was doing it to 3/4. And then the last one was a 2%, like 2 overall point percentage reduction of taxes in every single bracket. And I had people who described themselves as centrists at the door, who, as soon as I started talking about immigration, they'd get quieter, but they'd be like, yeah, you're kind of right. It's like way too much. Because I would just use the line, it's not me saying there's too many people entering the country. It's math saying there's too many people.
That's well, and people just start to feel it in other ways, in the cost of living, in cost of housing, in just kind of cultural changes that they might notice in their neighborhood. Obviously, the radical, Hamasniks protesting, or the ethnic fighting between Sikhs and Hindus in Brampton. Like, there are all kinds of data points that hit different Canadians in different ways. And I think that that's one of those things that they would quietly agree with, even if they wouldn't necessarily say it aloud. All right, well, Wyatt, we gave some free advice to the Conservative Party. Take it or leave it. I do think that Pierre Poilievre ran a good campaign, and I think he should stay on as leader of the party, but definitely make some changes for the next election. Anything else you want to say on this topic?
I'd echo what you're saying. I think Poilievre had far more virtues than he had ever had drawbacks as leader. Better leader than O'Toole, easily better leader than Andrew Scheer, and I would say he was better leader than Harper was in 2015. So it would be preemptive to say, well, he lost, he has to go. I've even heard the idea that whenever you have a leader who maybe even underperformed, they're only ever going to be 15% of the issue. And I don't even think that Poilievre was much of an issue at all. In fact, I think he added a lot of, if he was a different leader, we would probably have performed far worse. I would say that in so many ways, I hope that Poilievre doesn't get blamed for the problems of his own team behind him, because he's the leader. He's doing rallies every day. He's running around the country. He doesn't really have time to micromanage the people behind the scenes who are telling candidates they're not allowed to go to local debates. They're not allowed to go to events, and they're rolling out policy platforms really late in the campaign, and it's a little bit watery on certain issues, and they've probably focus grouped it a little bit too much. That's the big area that they need to have change. It's the back room of people who, frankly, over the last couple of days have been slapping each other on the back and saying, well, wasn't it such a great campaign? In some ways, but let's not keep gassing each other up when we didn't get the win. We got to actually demonstrate the ability to know, okay, here's a couple points we didn't do well on. Let's do better next time.
Well, exactly. I think we're going to head into an election inside 24 months, hopefully inside 18 months. I really do hope that this parliament is short-lived, and that the Conservatives have another chance to take back the country, and they have to learn from the mistakes. So that's why we wanted to document them here for you today. All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. That's Wyatt Claypool. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you, and God bless.
You're watching Juno News, Canada's fastest-growing independent news network. Our team works day and night to bring you nationwide coverage of the issues that matter. Honest reporting of the stories that put Canadians first. From far and wide, Juno is doing the work to turn the dial in the right direction, bringing you the news from the field and in the studio. Wherever it takes us, we get the job done. For you, for Canada. Subscribe today and help us replace the CBC. Go to junonews.com to join the fight.